Welcome to another deep dive. We are thrilled you are joining us today. You, the learner, are the exact reason we meticulously compile and analyze all this source material.
Yeah, it is excellent to be here to synthesize this with you.
And today we have an incredibly extensive agenda. We're entirely bypassing the, superficial trivia to rigorously examine the biology, the evolutionary history, and the really complex ecological reality of the family Ursidae. Bears.
Right. We are looking at a species family that occupies a really contradictory space in our understanding. I mean, we tend to categorize them as either innocent plush toys or these mindless apex killing machines.
Oh, absolutely. The cuddly teddy or the monster in the woods.
Exactly. But the actual biological reality is far more intricate. We're talking about rapid evolutionary shifts, highly specialized anatomy, and physiological processes that honestly currently defy our best medical technologies.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I want to start at the foundational level of how we even conceptualize this animal, specifically the linguistics of the word bear.
Oh, the linguistic history is fascinating.
It is. I was looking into the etymology, and it reveals this deep-seated psychological relationship that ancient humans had with these creatures. The English word bear derives from the Old English bera, which belongs to a larger family of Germanic terms, like the Swedish bjorn.
Right.
And for decades, the conventional linguistic wisdom suggested this stemmed from a Proto-Indo-European root meaning brown. So the assumption was just that bear simply meant the brown one.
Yeah, that was the accepted theory for quite some time.
But the sources say that's not quite right.
No, it's not. Deeper comparative linguistics actually demonstrated that a standalone Proto-Indo-European root, specifically meaning brown, at least in that morphological form, just doesn't exist.
Huh. So what did it mean?
The current consensus is that the root more accurately translated to wild animal or the wild one. But the really critical mechanism at play here isn't just the literal translation. It's the sociolinguistic phenomenon of taboo avoidance.
Right. Because the brown one, or the wild animal, was never intended to be its actual name. It operated entirely as a euphemism.
Exactly.
Because these early Germanic tribes inhabited heavily forested regions of northern Europe. These animals were apex predators there. The environment was highly dangerous, and the psychological weight of that danger actually manifested in their language.
They operated under this framework of magical thinking.
Yeah, they genuinely believed that uttering the creature's true name would effectively summon it right to their location.
What's really fascinating here is the sheer durability of that fear. The original Proto-Indo-European true name for the animal was a root that sounded something like Artodo.
Arcto.
Right. And the Germanic peoples completely excised this word from their daily lexicon. They substituted it with the euphemism for so many successive generations that the original root was permanently lost to the entire Germanic language family.
That is wild. It stands as one of the oldest and most successful examples of a euphemism entirely erasing a primary noun.
It really is a profound example of environment shaping human behavior and language.
They effectively created a linguistic void out of pure survival instinct. But while the Germanic languages lost the root, Archito was preserved elsewhere. Right?
Oh, absolutely. If you trace the Hellenic and Italic branches of the Indo-European tree, the ancient Greeks retained Arptitos, and the Romans adapted it into Ursus.
And that ancient feared name is stamped across our modern maps today.
Precisely. The geographic applications are a direct lineage of that ancient root. The word Arctic is derived from Arcticos, which directly translates to the land of the bear.
Because bears live there.
Well, not merely because bears lived there, but because the region was situated under the northern constellations of Ursa Major, the Great Bear.
Oh, wow.
And conversely, Antarctic is the literal translation of the land without bears, or opposite the bear.
So you look at a globe, and the fundamental orienting poles of our entire planet are linguistically defined by the presence or absence of this single animal.
It speaks volumes about their dominance in the northern hemisphere.
It really does. But to understand how they achieved that ecological dominance, we need to trace their morphology back through deep time. Because taxonomically, bears are classified within the suborder Caniformia.
Meaning they are dog-like carnivorans.
Right. But the phylogenetic tree reveals a really startling divergence.
Yeah, if we connect this to the broader evolutionary timeline, we have to look back to the Eocene and Oligocene epochs. We're talking roughly 30 to 38 million years ago.
Okay.
If you analyze the genetic sequencing and the morphological traits of early fossils, you find that a bear's closest living relatives today are not actually canines.
Which is so counterintuitive.
It is. Their closest relatives are the pinnipeds, which include seals, sea lions, and walruses, and the mustaloids, a really diverse group encompassing raccoons, badgers, and red pandas.
See, I want you, the listener, to really visualize this evolutionary link. When you observe a massive modern grizzly, the instinct is to compare it to a wolf or maybe a large feline. But the fossil record of their early ancestors, specifically an extinct subfamily called Amphicodontinae, paints a radically different picture.
Radically different.
We have specimens like Perictus from North America and Allosayan that demonstrate these basal ancestors were small, semi-aquatic mammals. We're talking about creatures roughly the size of a modern badger.
Yeah, with anatomical adaptations totally suited for swimming and foraging in riparian environments.
Just a badger-sized swimming bear ancestor. It's incredible.
The transition from those semi-aquatic ancestors to modern bears is just a phenomenal study in adaptive radiation.
How so?
Well, from the Amphicodontinae, the lineage progresses into Eurasia with these dog-like, raccoon-sized creatures like cephalogale during the Oligocene, and this lineage eventually gives rise to the genus Ursavis in the early Miocene.
And biologists generally consider that the ancestral node for all living bear species.
Right. Exactly.
But the branching from that Ursavis node is anything but linear. I noticed in the data that the very first group to diverge from the main lineage wasn't the brown or black bears.
No, it was the ancestors of the giant panda.
Which blew my mind.
Yeah, the subfamily Aleuropodinae branched off approximately 19 million years ago. They represent this incredibly ancient, distinct lineage that isolated itself and began highly specialized evolutionary adaptations really early on.
Well, the main trunk of the family tree just continued to diversify.
Right, eventually producing the subfamilies that encompass our modern bears, as well as some pretty spectacular extinct clades.
Okay, we absolutely must address the extinct clade of the Tremarctinae, the short-faced bears, because the scale of these animals completely alters our understanding of Pleistocene ecology.
Oh, the Tremarctinae were massive. They migrated into the Americas and underwent massive evolutionary scaling. The prehistoric South American short-faced bear, Arctotherium angustidens, actually holds the record.
For what?
As the largest species of bear and potentially the largest mammalian land predator known to have ever existed. Ever. The fossil evidence points to an animal that weighed up to 3,500 pounds and could reach a height of 11 feet when standing on its hind legs.
11 feet tall. The biomechanics required to support 3,500 pounds of mass while standing upright are just staggering.
Truly.
And that actually brings us directly to their physical architecture. Because surviving and dominating varied ecosystems requires more than just sheer size. It requires intense morphological versatility. Let's analyze their locomotion for a second.
Locomotion is a key differentiator for the Ursidae family. The vast majority of mammalian carnivores, felines, and canines, for example, utilize digitigrade locomotion.
Meaning they walk on their toes.
Right. They walk on their toes with their heel bones elevated, which maximizes stride length and sprinting speed.
Like a greyhound?
Exactly. Bears, conversely, are plantigrade. Like humans, they distribute their weight across the entire sole of the foot, bringing the heel bone fully into contact with the ground.
And while that plantigrade stance sacrifices the explosive sprinting speed of a digitigrade predator, the biomechanical trade-off is immense stability.
Immense!
Because they possess this broad, flat-footed base, they are capable of incredibly stable bipedalism. They can stand completely upright for extended periods to survey their environment, and they can sit upright with perfect balance.
And the evolutionary advantage of that stable, upright posture is that it completely liberates the forelimbs from the constant necessity of bearing weight.
Their front paws become specialized tools.
Exactly. They are equipped with 5 non-retractable claws on each foot, and crucially, their wrists maintain a high degree of supination and pronation.
So they can rotate them.
Yeah, they can rotate their paws inward to grasp objects, manipulate fruit, or physically wrestle prey in a way a wolf simply cannot.
And the pinnacle of that wrist flexibility has to be the giant panda's anatomical anomaly. They have developed what is essentially a pseudo-thumb.
The panda's thumb is a classic example of evolutionary exaptation. It is not an actual phalange, like a primate's thumb.
Right, it's a wrist bone.
Yes, it is an enlarged radial sesamoid bone, a bone embedded within the tendon of the wrist. Over millions of years, this bone elongated and became padded with tissue.
And it functions as an opposable grip.
It allows the panda to cleanly strip leaves from bamboo stalks with remarkable dexterity while sitting upright.
It functions as a biological multi-tool. And their sensory architecture is just as robust as their physical mechanics. We frequently use canines as the gold standard for olfactory capabilities, but the biological data indicates a bear's olfactory bulb is exponentially more powerful.
They likely possess the most acute sense of smell of any terrestrial mammal.
Better than a bloodhound.
Oh, absolutely. Their olfactory epithelium, the tissue inside the nasal cavity responsible for detecting odor molecules, is massive. The surface area is vastly larger than that of a bloodhound.
And they use that for complex environmental mapping, right?
Yeah. Detecting estrus in mates. Identifying territorial boundaries marked by rivals, pinpointing food sources across vast distances. A polar bear, for instance, can detect a seal carcass from up to 20 miles away beneath a layer of solid ice.
20 miles away, under ice.
It's unbelievable.
But their vision presents an interesting divergence from typical carnivore traits. The physiological data shows that bears have retained color vision, which is relatively rare among the carnivora order.
Right, because most carnivores operate primarily in low-light conditions and have sacrificed color-detecting cone cells in favor of light-gathering rod cells to track moving prey.
But bears kept the color vision.
Bears have maintained it, yes. The prevailing evolutionary hypothesis is that this visual acuity is directly tied to their foraging behaviors. Being able to visually distinguish the specific color wavelengths of ripe berries or nutrient-dense foliage against a green background provides a distinct survival advantage.
So they have this hyper-advanced nose and retain color vision, but they actually lack a highly common mammalian sensory tool. Bears are entirely unique among terrestrial carnivores in that they possess absolutely no touch-sensitive facial whiskers, no vibrissae.
The absence of vibrissae is a really notable morphological anomaly. Felines, canines, and even their closest relatives, the pinnipeds, rely heavily on vibrissae for tactile feedback.
Especially in tight spaces.
Right, navigating tight spaces or sensing the minute movements of prey in close proximity. The loss of these structures in bears suggests a complete evolutionary pivot.
Because they just rely so heavily on that incredible nose.
Their reliance on olfaction, combined with highly prehensile lips used for foraging, essentially rendered facial vibrissae biologically redundant.
Which logically leads us to investigate what exactly they're utilizing these specialized senses and prehensile lips to consume. Because this presents a fascinating taxonomic paradox.
It really does.
Biologically, they are classified squarely within the order Carnivora. But if you examine their gastrointestinal tract, they possess a simple, single-chambered stomach, a relatively short and undifferentiated intestine, and crucially, they lack a cecum.
The lack of a cecum is the defining limitation. In herbivores, the cecum is a large, specialized pouch located at the junction of the small and large intestines.
It's basically a fermentation vat.
Exactly. It houses symbiotic bacteria required to break down complex plant cellulose. Because bears evolved from a pure carnivore lineage, their digestive architecture is optimized for quickly processing highly digestible proteins and lipids.
Meat and fat.
Yes. They simply do not possess the internal hardware designed for a plant-based diet.
Yet, despite lacking the anatomical equipment for herbivory, the ecological data shows that the majority of the 6 extant bear species are opportunistic omnivores.
They derive a massive portion of their caloric intake from plant matter.
And the extreme manifestation of this digestive contradiction is, again, the giant panda.
The giant panda represents an extreme physiological tightrope walk. Genetically and anatomically, it remains a carnivore. It still possesses the genes coding for carnivore-specific digestive enzymes.
Yet its diet consists of over 99% bamboo.
A tough, fibrous grass with incredibly low nutritional density.
So how does an organism survive by feeding a pure carnivore's digestive tract an exclusive diet of wood?
It manages this solely through extreme microbiome adaptation and behavioral modification. The panda's gut has been colonized by specific strains of bacteria, such as those from the Clostridium genus, which assist in breaking down some of the cellulose.
But it's still a short intestine.
Right. Because the transit time through their short carnivore intestine is rapid, the fermentation process is severely truncated, the digestion is profoundly inefficient.
So they just have to eat constantly.
To compensate for the minuscule amount of energy extracted from each bite, A panda must consume up to 40 pounds of bamboo daily, requiring 12 to 15 hours of continuous eating.
They are essentially trapped in an endless cycle of foraging just to meet their baseline metabolic rate.
Exactly.
But if we shift our focus to the opposite end of the dietary spectrum, we find the polar bear, which provides an equally extreme example of evolutionary adaptation.
The divergence of the polar bear from the brown bear lineage is a relatively recent evolutionary event. It occurred roughly 400,000 years ago due to northern glaciation isolating certain populations.
And on the Arctic ice floes, terrestrial plant life is entirely non-existent.
To survive, these isolated bears had to completely abandon the omnivorous habits of their ancestors and pivot to hypercarnivory.
Preying almost exclusively on seals.
Ringed and bearded seals, yes.
And the dental morphology changes required for that pivot are what I found most compelling in the source material. Because most modern bears have evolved flat, bunodont molar teeth, which are highly effective for crushing nuts and grinding fibrous plant matter.
But the polar bear required cutting tools to slice through thick seal hide and blubber. Evolutionary biologists note that polar bears secondarily re-evolved carnassial-like cheek teeth. This is a fascinating occurrence because it seemingly borders on violating Dollo's law of irreversibility.
Which states that an organism cannot return to a previous evolutionary state.
Right. The polar bear didn't perfectly recreate the ancestral teeth, but it subjected its existing flattened molars to intense selective pressure until they reshaped into sharp slicing instruments optimized for a hypercarnivorous diet.
That adaptability is incredible. And their adaptations to the Arctic extend far beyond their dentition into the realm of complex optical physics. The structure of the polar bear's coat is a masterclass in thermal engineering.
It really is. The common perception is that polar bear fur is white to provide camouflage against the snow.
Which makes sense on the surface.
And while it does function effectively as camouflage, the white appearance is actually an optical illusion caused by the structural properties of the hair.
Right, because the individual guard hairs do not contain any white pigment at all. Each hair is a transparent, hollow tube of keratin.
And when ambient light strikes the fur, the hollow structures scatter and reflect the visible light spectrum, which our eyes perceive as white.
But the primary function of these hollow hairs isn't visual, it is thermal.
The hollow core of the guard hairs traps insulating air, but more importantly, the translucent nature of the hair allows solar radiation to penetrate deep into the coat.
It channels the sun.
The hair effectively channels the sun's thermal energy down to the bear's epidermis. And underneath that thick layer of optical illusion, a polar bear's skin is entirely black.
The black skin acts as a massive thermal sink, absorbing all of that channeled solar energy. Combine that with a subdermal layer of blubber that can be up to 4 inches thick, and heavily furred soles of their feet for traction and insulation.
You have an organism perfectly calibrated to thrive in sub-zero environments.
Absolutely. And this physical calibration is matched by equally complex behavioral ecology. Because when analyzing their social structures, researchers classify bears as the most asocial of all carnivore families.
With the exception of a mother rearing her cubs, or temporary aggregations around abundant, localized food sources like an Alaskan salmon run, they are fundamentally solitary animals.
And the ecological pressure driving that solitude makes perfect sense. Because their omnivorous diet is often inefficient or relies on dispersed resources like berry patches, a given territory simply cannot support a dense population of massive bears. They have to spread out.
Right, but solitude does not equate to a lack of communication. They operate a highly sophisticated asynchronous communication network.
Tell us about their vocal repertoire, because it's surprisingly nuanced.
It is. While they lack the complex pack vocalizations of wolves, they utilize specific sounds for distinct social contexts. Mothers and cubs, or mating pairs in non-aggressive contexts, communicate through low-frequency chuffing, grunting, and tongue clicking.
Tongue clicks.
Yeah. And aggressive encounters elicit rapid jaw clicking, lip popping, and deep resonant roaring designed to convey size and intent without resorting to physical combat.
Because physical combat is incredibly risky for a solitary predator. If you get injured, you can't hunt, you can't forage, you starve.
Exactly.
The acoustic data on the cubs is particularly interesting to me. When cubs are nursing or comfortable in the den, they produce a continuous, high-pitched vocalization that sounds exactly like a motor humming.
They literally hum.
Yeah, but vocalizations only work in close proximity. To manage their vast, overlapping territories while actively avoiding physical encounters, they rely heavily on chemical communication.
Scent marking is the primary infrastructure of bear society. They establish scent posts along frequently traveled corridors by aggressively biting and clawing at tree trunks.
Leaving visual scars.
Right. The visual scarring draws attention to the site, where the bear will then rub its head, neck, and back against the bark, depositing complex chemical signatures from specialized sebaceous glands.
It functions as an environmental bulletin board.
Other bears can investigate these scent posts and determine the sex, reproductive status, and even the individual identity of the bear that left it.
And different species utilize different chemical delivery systems, too. Giant pandas utilize a highly pungent, waxy secretion from large anal glands to mark territory boundaries. And polar bears have developed a completely unique tracking system adapted to the featureless ice.
Yes, the biomechanics of the polar bear's foot play a role in their chemical signaling. They possess pedal scent glands on the soles of their feet.
On their feet.
As they traverse the vast expanses of the Arctic pack ice, they press these chemical markers directly into the snow with every single step,
Leaving an invisible trail.
This allows males to effectively track the precise movements of estrus females across hundreds of miles of terrain where visual markers like trees obviously do not exist.
Now, returning to their foraging behavior, the solitary nature of bears is often disrupted by highly specific dietary cravings. The physiological data indicates a pervasive preference for high-energy, simple carbohydrates.
Put simply, they possess a massive evolutionary sweet tooth.
Exactly. And the drive for dense caloric reward heavily influences their foraging strategies. The sun bear, found in the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, possesses an exceptionally long, highly mobile tongue specifically adapted for extracting honey from wild bee nests, seemingly oblivious to the defensive stings.
And the sloth bear of the Indian subcontinent has undergone even more radical morphological changes to target specific protein and sugar sources.
The sloth bear is a prime example of convergent evolution toward myrmecophagy, the eating of ants and termites.
They have completely lost their upper inner incisors, creating a permanent gap in the front of their mouths. Their lips have evolved to be highly protrusible, and they can voluntarily seal their nostrils shut.
To become a vacuum.
Literally, the mechanics of their feeding are highly specialized. They utilize their massive inward-curving claws to tear open concrete-like termite mounds. Then, using that gap in their teeth and their protrusible lips, they create a biological vacuum,
They just forcefully inhale.
sucking thousands of termites and grubs from deep within the colony directly into their mouths. The evolutionary loss of those incisors was a direct adaptation to maximize the efficiency of this vacuum mechanism.
That is amazing. But the drive for these high-energy food sources becomes highly problematic when their territories intersect with human settlements. The research extensively documents the phenomenon of hyperphagia in bears.
Which is an intense physiological drive to consume massive amounts of calories, particularly leading up to winter.
Right. And when bears discover anthropogenic food sources, specifically processed sugars and garbage in tourist-heavy areas, their biological reward system is basically hijacked.
Anthropogenic food conditioning is a significant ecological issue. Bears are highly intelligent and possess excellent spatial memory. Once they associate human infrastructure with high-caloric, easily accessible food, their natural foraging behaviors are completely disrupted.
The data demonstrates that in environments where waste is improperly managed, bears can develop physiological dependencies on human garbage.
They completely alter their circadian rhythms to become nocturnal scavengers and lose their natural aversion to human proximity.
It is a stark example of an ancient, finely tuned survival mechanism colliding with modern human environments. But that drive for calories, that intense period of hyperphagia, is the necessary prerequisite for what is arguably the most extraordinary physiological feat in the mammalian world.
We need to examine the mechanics of winter dormancy, commonly referred to as hibernation.
Yes, because the term hibernation is often colloquially misunderstood as just a prolonged period of deep sleep.
Right, like a really long nap.
Exactly. But in reality, the winter dormancy of the Ursidae family, specifically brown and black bears, is a state of extreme metabolic suppression and biochemical recycling that honestly borders on the miraculous.
Let's quantify that suppression. When a bear enters the den, its core body temperature decreases, but not drastically, only by roughly 4 to 7 degrees Celsius.
So they do not enter a near-freezing state of torpor like smaller mammals, such as ground squirrels.
No, they remain relatively warm and capable of arousal if threatened. But the cardiovascular suppression is staggering. Their heart rate drops from a baseline active rate of 55 beats per minute down to as low as 9 beats per minute.
9 beats per minute. Maintaining cardiac function at 9 beats per minute without resulting in catastrophic tissue death or blood pooling requires fundamental alterations at the cellular level.
This is where the biomechanics of the protein myosin come into play.
Explain the myosin for us.
Myosin is a motor protein found in striated muscle tissue, including the heart, responsible for muscle contraction. During normal cardiac function, myosin binds to actin filaments and consumes ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the primary energy currency of the cell, to generate the force of a heartbeat.
So if a human heart slowed to 9 beats a minute, the cells would rapidly exhaust their energy reserves, attempting to maintain standard contractility. It would lead to heart failure. So how does the bear's heart survive that?
The physiological research indicates that during hibernation, the myosin proteins in the bear's heart undergo a structural shift into what researchers classify as a super-relaxed state.
A super relaxed state.
In this conformational state, the myosin heads essentially detach and fold back, drastically reducing the heart muscle's overall consumption of ATP.
Saving all that cellular energy.
This biochemical adaptation allows the heart to maintain a slow, steady rhythm for months without exhausting the cellular energy reserves.
And the biochemical engineering extends far beyond the cardiovascular system into the renal and digestive systems. The parameters of their dormancy are almost unbelievable. For a period extending up to 100 days, a hibernating bear completely ceases all intake and output.
100 days.
They consume 0 calories, they drink 0 water, and they do not urinate or defecate for over 3 months.
Managing metabolic waste under these conditions is a monumental biological challenge.
Because of the toxicity, right?
Exactly. In a non-hibernating mammal, the breakdown of proteins generates nitrogenous waste, specifically ammonia, which is highly toxic. The liver converts ammonia into urea, which the kidneys filter out to be expelled as urine. If a human were unable to urinate for even a few days, the accumulation of urea in the blood would lead to fatal uremia.
So how does the bear manage this toxic buildup without functioning kidneys?
The bear's physiology solves this through an elaborate internal recycling system. Instead of expelling the urea is absorbed through the bladder wall back into the bloodstream and transported to the intestine.
And then what happens?
There, specialized gut bacteria hydrolyze the urea, breaking it back down into its constituent nitrogen components. The bear's metabolic pathways then salvage this nitrogen and use it to synthesize new amino acids.
So they're essentially rebuilding their own proteins from their own metabolic waste.
They are operating a closed-loop biological recycling facility while unconscious.
And they manage the solid waste by forming a tappen?
Right, the fecal plug.
Yeah, a fecal plug in the distal colon, composed of slued intestinal cells, hair, and whatever indigestible material was consumed right before denning.
This plug physically prevents the expulsion of any waste, ensuring the closed system remains completely sealed.
Because of this recycling of nitrogen, a bear can emerge from a 100-day fast having lost massive amounts of fat, but with its skeletal muscle mass and bone density almost entirely preserved.
It is a level of metabolic mastery that human medicine is currently desperate to replicate.
Oh, I can imagine.
Understanding these pathways could revolutionize treatments for muscle atrophy in bedridden patients, osteoporosis, and the physiological degradation associated with long-term space travel.
But the absolute apex of this physiological marvel is reproduction, because female bears do not just survive this extreme fasting state. They actively gestate, give birth, and lactate while sealed inside the den.
The reproductive cycle of the bear is governed by a process known as embryonic diapause, or delayed implantation.
How does that work in practice?
Mating typically occurs in the late spring or early summer when food is abundant. However, if the embryo were to implant immediately, the cubs would be born in the autumn, facing the harshest conditions of the year.
So to avoid this, the female's reproductive system essentially hits the pause button.
Exactly. The fertilized egg develops into a blastocyst, but it stops growing and remains floating freely within the uterus for months. It only implants into the uterine wall and resumes active gestation in late autumn.
And only if she's ready, right?
Only if the female has successfully accumulated sufficient fat reserves during hyperphagia. If she has not met the biological threshold of body fat, the blastocyst will simply be reabsorbed.
Assuming successful implantation, though, the active gestation period is remarkably short, roughly 60 days.
The female briefly rouses from her deep dormancy in midwinter to deliver the cubs, and the physical state of the cubs at birth is a direct result of this abbreviated gestation inside a fasting mother.
They are born highly altricial. They are blind, completely deaf, practically hairless and weigh only a few ounces, a tiny fraction of a percent of their mother's body weight.
They are entirely incapable of thermoregulation. Their survival depends entirely on crawling blindly through their mother's fur to reach her teats and latching on,
And for the remainder of the winter, the mother just continues to fast.
relying entirely on her stored lipids to sustain her own basal metabolism while simultaneously synthesizing incredibly rich, high-fat milk for her cubs. By the time they emerge from the den in the spring, the mother has exhausted massive energy reserves, while the cubs have transformed from helpless ounces of tissue into robust, mobile animals.
The thermodynamic efficiency required for this process actually led researchers to an incredibly counterintuitive discovery regarding the relationship between the size of the bear and the duration of hibernation.
Right, because the logical assumption would be that a massive grizzly carrying significantly more adipose tissue would possess the thermal mass and energy reserves to hibernate significantly longer than a smaller species like the American black bear.
But that assumption is physiologically incorrect. The empirical data demonstrates that smaller bears are actually capable of sustaining hibernation for longer periods than larger bears.
The determining factor is the basal metabolic rate governed by thermodynamics.
Let's break down the physics of why that happens.
It relates to surface area to volume ratios and thermal regulation. A smaller bear has less overall mass to keep warm, and its physiology allows it to safely drop its core body temperature slightly lower than a larger bear can.
So its internal thermostat is set lower.
Because its internal thermostat is set to a lower baseline, the rate at which it metabolizes its fat reserves to generate body heat is significantly slower. A massive brown bear must burn through its fat at a much higher relative rate simply to maintain the baseline temperature required for its enormous mass.
Therefore, the smaller bear's fuel tank, while smaller in total volume, burns fuel much more efficiently, extending the maximum possible duration of dormancy.
It perfectly illustrates how evolutionary pressures optimize different morphological profiles for specific survival strategies. They are masters of their ecological niches.
Yet, despite millions of years of perfectly calibrated evolution, from their plantigrade mechanics to their closed-loop metabolic recycling, they have encountered a rapid environmental variable they cannot adapt to: the expansion of human civilization.
The dynamic between Homo sapiens and the Ursidae family is arguably one of the most complex, paradoxical interspecies relationships in existence.
It is characterized by an extreme dichotomy of profound cultural reverence and systemic ecological destruction.
Let's analyze the cultural reverence first because it stretches back to the very dawn of human expression.
If we look at Paleolithic archaeology, evidence of bear worship is ubiquitous. Cave paintings in Chauvet, France, dating back over 30,000 years, feature bears prominently.
And the astronomical data we discussed earlier, the constellation of Ursa Major, reveals an incredibly deep mythological root.
The cosmic hunt myths.
Yes, the association of that specific grouping of stars with the figure of a bear is remarkably consistent across diverse, isolated cultures. Anthropological research tracing these myths reveals that the concept of the Great Bear constellation is at least 13,000 years old.
It predates the end of the last ice age.
Human populations carried this specific mythological framework with them as they migrated from Eurasia across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas.
The mythological footprint is just staggering. Prehistoric Finns, indigenous Siberian tribes, and early Korean cultures all place the bear at the apex of their spiritual hierarchies, often viewing them as the direct spirits of their forefathers or divine messengers.
In shamanic traditions spanning across North America and the Eurasian steppe, the solitary, powerful nature of the bear was directly associated with the solitary spiritual journey of the shaman.
There was even a widespread belief in the ability of spiritual leaders to physically or spiritually transfigure into bears.
This reverence is also evident in ancient European pantheons. The Celtic tribes worshipped a bear goddess named Archeo.
And historical evidence of her cult was heavily concentrated in the region that is now Bern, the capital of Switzerland.
Right, and the etymology of Bern itself is intrinsically linked to the animal. The city's name is derived from the German word for bear, and the animal remains the central figure on the city's heraldic shield to this day.
That ancient reverence hasn't vanished either. It has simply evolved into modern cultural iconography. Bears saturate our modern media and developmental psychology.
Winnie the Pooh, Paddington Bear, Yogi Bear, the Care Bears.
They are universally utilized to represent comfort, protection, and innocence in childhood development. And the most prominent example of this modern iconography is, of course, the teddy bear.
Which serves as a perfect historical microcosm of the human bear paradox.
The history of the teddy bear is a brilliant encapsulation of that duality. In 1902, the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, was participating in a highly publicized hunting expedition in Mississippi. His guide, Holt Collier, had tracked down an American black bear with hounds. The bear was exhausted and beaten, and the hunting party tied the incapacitated animal to a willow tree.
And then they summoned the president.
They summoned the president to the site and offered him the opportunity to shoot it.
But Roosevelt, operating under the ethical framework of aristocratic sportsmanship, refused to shoot the tethered animal, declaring it fundamentally unsportsmanlike.
The incident was widely reported, and a political cartoonist named Clifford Berryman immortalized the event in a cartoon published in the Washington Post. It depicted Roosevelt refusing to shoot a stylized, frightened bear cub.
The cartoon went viral by early 20th century standards. A Brooklyn candy shop owner and toy maker named Morris Mictum saw the cartoon, recognized the emotional resonance, and constructed a small, stuffed, plush bear.
He placed it in his shop window with a sign calling it Teddy's Bear, supposedly after receiving written permission from Roosevelt himself. The demand was instantaneous, spawning a global industry.
It is a narrative that highlights our capacity for empathy and our desire to project human morality onto nature. However, the paradox lies in the fact that while we mass-produce plush representations to comfort our children, our real-world ecological actions have driven the actual biological family to the brink of crisis.
The data on their conservation status provides a really grim counter-narrative to our cultural affection. Historically, the balance of power between humans and bears shifted definitively and permanently with the advent of firearms. We removed them from their position as unassailable apex predators.
Today, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, lists 6 of the 8 extant bear species as vulnerable to extinction.
Even the 2 species categorized as least concern globally, the brown bear and the American black bear, face severe localized threats. In numerous isolated regions, they are at high risk of extirpation, which is localized extinction, due to massive habitat fragmentation.
As human agricultural and urban infrastructure expands, the vast contiguous territories required by a solitary, wide-ranging omnivore are severely compromised, leading to increased, often fatal, human-wildlife conflicts.
And the threat extends beyond passive habitat loss into aggressive, systemic exploitation. The most severe example documented in the research is the illegal wildlife trade surrounding the Asian black bear and the sun bear, driven primarily by the demand for traditional medicine.
The biomedical component at the center of this trade is ursodeoxycholic acid, or UDCA. It is a bile acid produced in the liver and stored in the gallbladder of bears.
For centuries, traditional medical practices, primarily localized in East Asia, have prescribed bear bile to treat a variety of ailments ranging from liver disease to inflammatory conditions.
While modern pharmacology can synthetically synthesize UDCA in laboratories, rendering the extraction from live animals biologically unnecessary, a massive black market demand for wild or pure bile persists.
And the methods used to meet this demand are horrific. Because international trade in bear parts is strictly prohibited under CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, a massive network of domestic bear farms has been established. The ecological data estimates that over 12,000 bears are currently consigned in specialized farming facilities across China, Vietnam, and South Korea.
The physiological and psychological impact on the animals is catastrophic. We have established that bears are biologically driven to roam vast territories and are profoundly solitary. In these facilities, they are confined in extraction cages, often barely larger than their own bodies, for years, sometimes decades.
The bile is extracted through surgical fistulas or implanted catheters, leading to chronic infections, severe psychological distress, and physical deterioration.
It represents the darkest manifestation of our relationship with the species, reducing a highly intelligent, complex organism into a captive biological manufacturing plant.
Yet, the conservation landscape is not entirely devoid of optimism. We also possess the capacity for massive, coordinated preservation efforts.
The giant panda stands as the premier global example of successful conservation intervention. Decades of intensive habitat protection, stringent anti-poaching enforcement, and complex international breeding programs have yielded measurable results.
The establishment of the Sichuan giant panda sanctuaries, encompassing 7 nature reserves and 9 scenic parks, protects the habitat for roughly 30% of the highly fragmented wild panda population.
Due to these efforts, the IUCN actually downgraded the giant panda status from endangered to vulnerable in 2016.
It proves that when sufficient geopolitical will and financial resources are applied, we can alter the trajectory of decline. There are robust networks of dedicated researchers and organizations operating globally. Groups like Polar Bears International monitoring Arctic sea ice depletion and the Bornean Sun Bear Conservation Center working to rehabilitate victims of the illegal pet and bile trades.
Their work leverages the positive public perception of bears to drive actionable ecological policy. That empathy is a critical ecological tool. Because we identify with their bipedalism, their omnivorous diets, and their fierce maternal instincts, the public is generally willing to support initiatives that protect them, provided they understand the biological reality rather than just the mythological caricature.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of our deep dive. We have tracked this organism across a staggering expanse of time in biology. We started with the psychological terror of the ancient Germanic tribes, who utilized a euphemism to avoid summoning the brown one from the dark woods. We trace their evolutionary lineage back 38 million years to the Amphisanodontinae, visualizing a semi-aquatic, otter-like ancestor navigating the Eocene waterways.
We examined the profound mechanical adaptations that allowed them to dominate the terrestrial landscape. The stability of plantigrade locomotion, the evolutionary acceptation of the panda's pseudothumb, and an olfactory system that maps the environment with molecular precision.
We analyzed the absolute extremes of their physiological capacities. We looked at a giant panda relying on gut microbes to extract minimal calories from bamboo using a carnivore's digestive tract, spending 15 hours a day eating just to survive. We broke down the optical physics of the polar bear's hollow, translucent fur channeling solar radiation to black skin, and we explored the biochemical miracle of hibernation.
A heart dropping to 9 beats a minute, myosin proteins entering a super relaxed state to conserve ATP, and the internal recycling of metabolic waste to maintain muscle mass during a 100-day fast.
It is a testament to the immense, relentless ingenuity of evolutionary biology. They are organisms defined by their adaptability, surviving epochs of drastic environmental shifts through highly specialized biological engineering. I want to sincerely thank you, the learner, for undertaking this massive analytical journey with us. Our goal is to provide the deep, nuanced context required to truly understand the source material, and it has been phenomenal exploring the mechanics of the Ursidae family with you today.
It has been highly rewarding to parse the complexities of their biology and their paradoxical relationship with human civilization. However, before we conclude, I want to present a final, forward-looking biological anomaly for you to consider.
The final provocative thought. What do the sources indicate?
Throughout this discussion, we have analyzed evolution as an historical process, events that occurred millions of years ago with the Ursavis or the Tremarctinae. However, biological researchers examining the current populations of modern bears have noted significant ongoing morphological variations, specifically within their dental formulas.
Right. Their teeth currently sit in an anatomical middle ground, somewhere between the slicing carnassials of a pure predator and the flat, grinding bunodont molars of a dedicated herbivore.
Precisely. The data indicates that this high degree of dental variation within single species is not a stable evolutionary endpoint. Biologists interpret this specific morphological instability as evidence that the Ursidae family is currently, at this very moment, in the active, measurable process of evolving away from an omnivorous diet to a predominantly herbivorous one.
It is a live, real-time evolutionary event occurring right in front of our scientific instruments.
And as we documented with the polar bear's secondary carnivory, they are fully capable of reversing this trend under extreme environmental pressure.
So they're actively rewriting their foundational biology as we speak.
Exactly. So here is the complex variable for you to mull over. Given the unprecedented velocity at which the Earth's climate is currently changing, how rapidly their historic habitats are fragmenting, and how their traditional food webs are collapsing or shifting, how will this incredible real-time evolutionary adaptability manifest?
Will the selective pressures force them into complete herbivory?
Will new radical morphological extremes emerge to process anthropogenic landscapes? They have successfully navigated 38 million years of a changing, hostile planet through sheer biological versatility. Based on the mechanics we've explored today, what will the bear of the future actually look like?
That is a phenomenal, open-ended biological question to end on. An apex survivor currently standing in the workshop of evolution. Thank you again for joining us on this deep dive. Keep critically analyzing the natural world, keep looking past the simplified stereotypes, and we'll catch you next time.